God is able to deliver thee has really been the conclusion of every lesson that we have studied thus far whenever we take and we look at that of hope. And this morning we continue in that series that we have been studying of when uh, hope when feeling alone, that is. And Lord willing, in a few weeks, we will finish out the series that we have been looking at with the final lesson that kind of brings it all together in talking about hope in hopelessness. And truly, one of the great things that we find whenever we go through life is that we know by having God on our side that we are able to overcome, that we are able to be, no doubt, victorious in the end, even through all the difficulties that we face. When we talk about the subject that's before us today of feeling alone, it is something that, or an emotion that so many people have felt. And taking and studying and really preparing for this lesson, one of the things that quickly had jumped out to me that this is something that almost everyone at one time or the other within their lives have really taken and have felt. That is the idea or feeling alone. I would imagine if I were to ask the question today, do you feel alone? That a lot of people would say yes to that. Statistically, 80% of people who are under the age of 18 or 18 and under would answer yes. That statistic was one that really kind of surprised me. But as I went through and was reading some of what was brought out within that, it was really going into this area and talking about how that you would see within these groups of kids that even within those who were considered to be the popular group, that there are always those in those groups who still feel alone. And the idea was as you go through life, you see that there are so many in that mindset to where they feel alone within their lives. And then it was said of that of adults that there are some 60% of adults who feel alone within their lives. And then continuing to look at it, I think one thing that stood out to me more than maybe some of the other thoughts was that of the fact that it says that between the age of 18 years old and 22 years old is the group that feels the loneliness. And when you take and you look at that and you think about all that is brought forth, it really comes out to show us that this idea or this emotion of loneliness is something that is really spread throughout that of all ages. It doesn't just belong to one person or one classification of people. There's a quote that I read to where it says loneliness is one of the most common human experiences, but it is also one of the least talked about. In taking and looking at this and considering all that is brought out before, it had went on to talk about how that loneliness is something that really just eats away at us. It's something that is really destructive for the soul in many ways. It was mentioned that in one of the social isolation studies that had taken place, that it was saying that being socially isolated, having that feeling of being alone and keeping yourself away from others is just as harmful to your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And then as I was reading on, it talked about something that I suppose we've all probably heard at one time or the other, and that's the broken heart syndrome. Got the correct name underneath it. I'm not going to pretend to even try to pronounce that. But whenever you take and you look at what is brought forth within this, you see that this is an emotion that oftentimes people will take and share. And it's actually a medical condition. Maybe not in the terms at times that we take and we look at it, but it is talking about an extreme emotional stress that manifests itself in the symptoms of having a heart attack. But when you start thinking about the seriousness of that, and you think about the fact that someone can become so alone, so brokenhearted, that it is as if they are having a heart attack, that their body is failing them, we know this to be a true difficulty that exists. But here's the thing. Loneliness is hard to define. And trying to take and to even put this lesson together in the direction in which I wanted to go with it, it's hard to define because it can be so subjective. That it can be a kid in school, all the way to a kid who has just graduated trying to figure out life, or going into someone who's in a middle age crisis of their life, or going into someone who has lost a loved one. And then there's so many other stages in between. Whenever we talk about loneliness, it's really just hard to take into to pinpoint a one particular study on what it is that we can do to overcome. But then again, the answer would be the same in every study that we could take in every direction maybe that is before us. That God is the answer. That God will deliver us. And as we think about what is brought forth within that, as we work through that of our study today, one of the things that I suppose that I saw suggested so often, and something that I believe to be very powerful, is that if we can understand that this sense of loneliness, that when we are in that place, or one may find themselves in that place, to be able to know that they are not truly alone, knowing that there are others who also have those emotions, it's strongly suggested that you reach out into those people, to talk to each other, in other words. Could we not quickly take and turn that to make that biblical? That we are to encourage each other, that we are to cry together, that we are to laugh together. No doubt when we take and we start finding what's in the scripture, and of course we'll look at this more a little bit later, but we find that it is so important to be able to see and to be able to know that our feelings, that we are just not alone on an island with those, that there's other people who also suffer. There's other people who also are facing those difficulties, and to be able to talk through those things is something that can be beneficial for us. But I believe also noting examples of people in the Bible who were able to overcome is powerful also. When you look at that of King David, and no doubt, if you were to go through the book of Psalms, you would find so many different laments that David had of the different difficulties and struggles that he had went through within his life. But it's there in the 25th Psalm and in verse 16 where we find here he says, turn yourself to me, talking to God. Have mercy on me, for I am desolate and afflicted. Sometimes for him it was sin. Sometimes for him it was life. It was just the difficulties in which he was facing. But when you take and you look at this, he had that mindset that even within that state of loneliness that he was in, that God had left him. Turn yourself to me. He's begging, have some mercy on me. Why? Because he is hurting, because he is alone. Maybe the prophet Elijah is another example that we could consider in 1 Kings 19:9, where he says there, I alone am I left, and they seek to take my life. Here it is within the work that he was doing. He really felt that he was the only prophet left. He wasn't, but that's what he felt. And because of that, it brought him into this place of great despair, of hopelessness within his life. But again, we see one who thought he was alone, one who had experienced loneliness, but yet to find still that God was with him. And then to take a turn a little bit, if you would. We now look at the words from God talking about that of man. And I believe this is why we feel that sense of loneliness that comes upon us so many times in our lives. And it's because of what God said there in Genesis 2:18. It's not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. God intends for us to have relationships. Relationships are those which are powerful within our lives as we go through that of the work relationships that we have, or the school relationships that we have, or the relationship of a spouse, or the relationship with children, whatever it may be, whatever level it may be found on, what we find is that God does desire for us to be together. God does desire for us to be able to truly be of that mindset to where we can lean on each other. But again, we go back to the subjective thought of loneliness. There's so many different levels of it. But whatever chapter of life that we may be in, when we have that sense of loneliness within us, hopelessness is close behind. So how do we respond to that? How do we respond to that feeling or that emotion of loneliness as we go about that of our lives today? And of course, as we take and as we look at that very question within itself, we need to take and to look to God to see what it is that He is able to do for us. There's one thing that I read that I found very interesting, where it's been said that our hearts, that they are a God-shaped vacuum that only He can fill. So when you take and you look at this and you think about the different lonely chapters of life in which one may be going through, what we see within that is that we need to be looking to God. Go back a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about hopelessness and emptiness. What was it that Solomon had done? What he did is he went through his life and he tried to gain all of the riches of the world. Why? Because he thought it was going to make him happy. I'll just build another barn and I'll be happier. I'll just get another servant and I'll be happy. I'll just get another musician and I'll be happy. Whatever it was that he was seeking for and trying to gain to become happy, did he get it? Did he get that happiness? No. In the end, what did he say? His conclusion was to fear God, right? He understood that it was about looking to God and understanding that God, no doubt, is the answer. And it's something that I want us to be able to think about, and I want us to be able to even see as we work through this. So as it is that we go through all of this and understand this, trying to fill ourselves with things of the world, empty pursuits, worldly pursuits, just as we studied 2 weeks ago, let us remember today, we'll never be content with that. So then we ask the question, well, how is it that we will find contentment in our lives? The Bible gives us an example of one who really takes and really conveys that unto us, who really shows us, again, what it is that we need within that of our lives today. And that's found within the book of Hebrews and in chapter 2 and in verse 17 of the scripture. But before we get to that, and as we think about that, one of the great things that we also see within this, when we talk about that of the scriptures, I want us to note that God is always in control of our lives. We'd like us to turn back to the book of the 102nd Psalm before we look at this text here. In the 102nd Psalm, I'd like us to read here in verses 1 through 11 of that Psalm. We read here about that of David again, and we look at this example as it's brought forth. And when we look at this example, one of the things that we find brought out within is that he really goes into that of what he was dealing with in his life. And I realize this is a bit of a lengthy reading, but bear with me. Again, the 102nd Psalm, and I'm going to start reading here within verse 1. And listen to these words here. He says, "Hear my prayer, O Lord, and let my cry come unto thee. Hide not thy face from me in the day when I am in trouble. Incline thine ear unto me in the day when I call. Answer me speedily. And my days are consumed like smoke, and my bones are burned as in hearth. My heart is smitten and withered like grass, as so I forget to eat my bread. For reason of the voice of my groaning, my bones cleave to my skin. I am like a pelican in the wilderness. I'm like an owl in the desert. I watch, and I am like a sparrow alone upon the housetop. My enemies, they reproach me all day, and they that are mad against me are sworn against me. For I've eaten ashes like bread, and mingled my drink with my weeping. Because of thine indignation and thy wrath, for thou hast lifted me up and cast me down." David pours out his heart here. He talks about the condition in which he was in and how he really felt that he was alone. And then he talks about those feelings, and he brings out these dramatic images depicting the very suffering in which he was going through. And it's emphasizing here the sense of loneliness, of hopelessness and despair. But then if you continue looking, look at verse 12 and 13 with me. It says, but thou, O Lord, shalt endure forever, and the remembrance unto all generations. Thou shalt rise and have mercy upon Zion, for the time to favor her, yea, the set time is come. When we think about all that was brought out, he used these letters to take and to write into the future generations, telling us that even the suffering that we go through within our lives today, that there is evidence in to know that God is there for us, that God will see us through the pain that we go in. And that's something that is covered in every facet of life. Wherever we may be within that sense of hopelessness, we are being told here, reminded here, that God is with us. God will rescue us, is what he is saying. God will deliver thee, as we sang. And as we think about what is brought forth within this, we again move forward now within that of our lesson, thinking about one who, no doubt, went through so many different things of his life, and he did so for a purpose. And there's much that we can learn about God and how he is there for us through the life of this one that is mentioned. We see him here in verses 17 and 18. It says, wherefore in all things it behooved him to be made like unto his brethren, that he might be merciful and faithful, high priest in the things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of people. For in that he himself hath suffered being tempted, he is able to succor or to help them that are tempted. When we take and we look at what is brought out within this man that the Hebrew writer writes about here is the life of Jesus. I want us to think about Jesus' life for a moment. The reason I want us to look at his life whenever we talk about loneliness is maybe it's something that we don't think about, but Jesus had went through so many different examples and so much time of loneliness within his short life that he had lived. But as we look at these, we first start in the book of Luke in chapter 2. In Luke chapter 2, we read here in verses 41 through 50 of the text. And what we find brought out within this is that it goes through and talks a bit about that of his family. We won't actually read these verses so that we can get through this lesson in a timely manner. But as you look at the account that's there, we see that as his family had left him at Pentecost, we know he was there. He was teaching people. And as he was there at Passover feast, and as he was teaching people and as it went about, then what we see here is that as they had missed him, they were looking for him. And then when they went back and they found him, one of the things that he had really mentioned and brought out unto them in verse 49, he says here, and he said unto them, how is it that you sought me? Wist you know that I must be about my Father's business? But then look at verse 50. He says, and it says there, and they understood not the saying which he spake unto them. I see this example that is brought out here of one who is growing up. Now, we know his plan was no doubt greater than what ours may be, but yet we still have a great plan in the sense of being able to be a Christian and be able to be saved and to have that eternal home with God in heaven. But how many of us who have raised kids or raising kids, or we were a kid ourselves, looked at our parents and said, you just don't understand me. You don't understand what I'm wanting to do. You see, it's a sense of loneliness that's being talked about here. Here Jesus is alone because his family truly did not understand the purpose that he had within his life. And I know oftentimes what happens, at least when I've looked at my own family at times, I can think about when the parents don't get it, your sibling's going to get it, right? No, not always. That certainly wasn't the case whenever we look at Jesus in John chapter 7. In John chapter 7 and verses 3 through 5, we find here it says, and his brethren therefore said unto him, depart hence and go into Judea, that thy disciples also may see the works that thou doest. For there is no man that doth anything in secret, and he himself seeketh to be known openly. If thou do these things, show thyself unto the world. And then verse 5 says, for neither did his brethren believe in him. So here it is, we take and we look at this example and we find this loneliness within the family of Jesus. That he had parents that truly did not understand what his purpose in life was. He had brethren that did not accept him for who he was. So here he is, not with the support of the family, but here he is out with this endeavor to serve God. And then the loneliness of his disciples. Maybe we could relate that in some way to friends or co-workers for that matter. As we think about what is brought forth within this, we can look in the book of John in chapter 16. In John chapter 16, and as we think about here in verses 32 and verse 33, it says, "Behold, the hour cometh, yea, is now come, that ye shall be scattered, every man his own, and shall leave me alone. And yet I am alone, because the Father is with me. I am not alone, excuse me, because the Father is with me. And these things I have spoken unto you, that it might have peace. And in the world shall ye have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." So we take and we look at what's brought out here within these verses. And one of the things that we can see again within this, that the flock within itself, as it was scattering about, one of the things that we find brought out here is that there were so many among them that really were not taking and accepting Jesus. And he was rejected. People were still wanting to go to John the Baptist, maybe it was, or some just didn't want to take and to accept Jesus Christ as truly being the Messiah. They were saying to them, he just didn't make sense. How could he be one who would be with that of the sinner, would not shun the sinner, but yet that he would find that he would be associating with them? This just didn't make sense to the people there. And they had a hard time following all of that. And then you take and you throw in that of the respectable religious people of that time. What they would do is that they would shun Jesus. They would leave him alone because they would not accept him. You go back to John chapter 6 and verse 15. It tells us that there were times that he actually left them. And then you would go into chapter 6 here of the book of John in verses 33 and 35, and it kind of opens it up a little bit more to where we see that there were people who would leave Jesus, who would not stay with him. As we take and as we look at that in John chapter 6, and we start reading here within verse 33, it states here, says, "For the bread of God is he, which cometh down from the heaven, and giveth life unto the world." Now, if you keep reading down through that, as he had declared himself being that of the bread of life, then look at verse 41, and it says, "And the Jews then murmured at him, because he said, I am the bread which came down from heaven." And then if you skip down and read verses 60 through 66, you see it opened up even more. But let's look at the conclusion there of verse 66. It says, "From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more." You see, Jesus had faced so many different times of loneliness, when people should have been with him, when his friends should have been with him, when his family should have been with him. We see that there were times that he was left alone. And then we think about as all of that had taken place in that sense to where they had left him in that place of great despair. We then find that it was in the Garden of Eden again that he was left alone. In the book of Matthew, in chapter 26, we see, of course, the events that had taken place here opened up unto us. But as we think about these very events and all that had transpired, what we see is that Jesus here, when he needed people maybe the most, in the way that maybe we would view it, what we find is that once again, he was left alone. In verses 36 through 46, it brings out and gives us that thought process within itself. We find that he was, as prophesied, this man of great sorrow, acquainted with grief, as Isaiah 53 teaches us there in verses 2 and 3. 3 times when he was in the garden, he went out to pray. And when he came back each time, what we find is they were not there to support him. He was alone. And then here it is. We know that he was in this great place of despair within his life. And let's look at a few of those verses. We look here in Matthew chapter 26, and we read verse 36. It says here, "Then cometh Jesus with them into a place called Gethsemane, and he saith unto the disciples, Sit ye here while I go and pray yonder." Then if you skip down and you look within verse 38, it says, "Then saith he unto them, My soul is exceeding sorrowful, even though unto death. Tarry ye here and watch with me." And then in verse 40, it says this, "And he cometh unto the disciples, and he findeth them asleep." He says unto Peter, what? Could ye not watch with me 1 hour? And then we see that it goes back again. We look in verse 41. He tells them, watch and pray that ye enter not into the temptation. And the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Then in verse 43, it says, and he came, he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. Verse 45, then cometh he to his disciples, and he saith unto them, sleep on now, and take your rest. Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of the sinner. When we take and we look at these events that had taken place within all of this, Peter couldn't wait an hour with him. Peter just couldn't be there to support him in a way that he had wanted to support. Jesus was in, no doubt, one of the hardest times, and especially leading up to the hardest time of his life, where he would take on the sins of mankind. And yet he was alone. You see, he felt those emotions, going back to Hebrews. He felt the emotions of the family not being there. He felt the emotions of the friends not being there. He felt the emotion of those closest to him in the Garden of Eden, or the Garden of Gethsemane here, not being with him. And then it carries over even into judgment. As you look in Matthew chapter 27, in verses 11 through 26, it goes through and it shows the great trials that no doubt he had went through. And I'd encourage you to read that on your own and to look through what is brought forth within this. Peter could have been there, but what did Peter do? Deny him. We think about all that he had went through. He went through it alone again. When you look at the support of the people who should have been around him within this world, which leads us to that of the loneliness at the cross in Matthew chapter 27 and verses 38 through 45. Here he was within one of the greatest times of distress within his life. And it is there within this chapter in verse 46. We have these words that, we read and have read so many times and really have always tried to understand. But we look at the end of that verse, it says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Once again, when we look at Jesus here, what he had done is he felt alone. I realize there's a lot of debate upon what these words say here and what they mean. It's not that we will take and to explore all of that this day, but let me put it this way simply. In some way, as man, when Jesus took upon himself all of the sins of the world, he being in his greatest anguish, God had to turn his back on him because God is not sin and God cannot be in sin. And as brief as it may have been, whatever had all transpired truly within, the cry of Jesus that we hear, my God, teaches us something very important. In the greatest time of despair, the greatest place of sorrow, the greatest place of hopelessness that we may ever be in, my God, your God, our God is there for us. You see, Jesus still accepted who God was when he had uttered those very words. Maybe best put this way, he never quit trusting in God. He never quit having hope in God the Father because he knew that God would deliver him. When his family turned on him, he knew that God would deliver him. When his friends turned on him, he said he looked to God because he knew God would deliver him. When those closest to him turned on him, he knew, as painful as it was, even though he wanted some other way to be figured out, he knew it had to be him to die upon that cross. He knew that God would be with him. On that cross again, when he was alone, truly alone, he knew that God would deliver him. What we can take from this, hopefully, is to know that God can deliver us. When we feel our loneliness within our lives, and I realize that we will have those times. There are voids that will come into our lives and sense of grief that will be upon us that we know that will never be truly healed, that the scars will always exist, that there will always be that void. But what I do know is that it doesn't matter what chapter of life we find ourselves in, our God will never forsake us. We will still cry, we will still hurt, we will still feel brokenhearted, but we have to look to God to overcome. Because if we can't find God, hopelessness will take over and it will destroy us. Because that's what hopelessness does. But God, he will deliver us, just as we sang a few moments ago. When we are able to look to him, Jesus looked to him in every situation because he knew that God again would deliver him. It's powerful for us to know, and we should realize this. God is on our side. He's not against any of us. Our God is for every one of us. He is in heaven. He loves you. He loves me. He cares for you, and he cares for me. That's the God we serve. That's the God who gave his son to die upon that cross so that we could have life everlasting. And no matter what it is that we face, one of the things that we need to understand within this is that God will never forsake us. I saw 5 things that someone had wrote, and I want us to quickly look at those, and I realized it was a little bit longer than I intended. But 5 things that was brought out, we're only going to look at 4 of those, though. The very first thing we need to do in our place of loneliness is we need to recognize God is there. Jesus just showed that to us. In his greatest time, when he felt forsaken, he says, my God, my God. When you look at whether it was Elijah or if you look at David, they all went to who? God. You see that example is set before us that we need to look to God. But in that, let us take and maximize God's strength within. I know this text is often used wrongly. But when we look at Philippians 4:13 and we think about that idea and that principle where I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, know that that is exactly what he does. He strengthens us. And we can get through the hardest times of our life. It will leave a scar at times, depending on what chapter we are in within our lives. But he can at least heal that scar enough for us to continue to serve him and to live with purpose here on this earth. And then use your time. I would say here, use your time wisely. Keep busy for God is what I would add to what this person had suggested. And I added Ephesians 5 and verse 16 about us redeeming the times. This past week, in speaking to one of this congregation, some of the words that she had shared to me as she talked about her own grief, but she kept herself busy. That is how she was able to push through and how she pushes through. Keeping ourselves busy for the Lord puts our focus upon God. That's what Solomon warned us about. Don't get lost in the focus of everything else. And then you look at Jesus, people that we are going to depend upon on different times of difficulty, they will forsake us. People of this world will. But God will be there for us. Let us serve God. And then finally, sympathize with others in need. We can be the greatest support system for each other, and we should be as Christians today. We as Christians, no doubt, as a spiritual family, we have been created as being brothers and sisters in Christ, to listen to each other, to encourage each other, and to help each other when we suffer. But we must not forget in all of this that our God is there for us. Our God is there for you. Our God is there for me. Let us always look to him because he can deliver.